going to be kind of talking about method to some degree. I have the initial part of it is to discussing whether good teaching actually involves method or not. And this came about from a guy called Luke Prodrumo. Some of you may have seen him talk. Unfortunately, he died earlier this year. A very entertaining and interesting presenter. And a few years ago, I was doing a talk at a conference, and we were both giving kind of plenaries, whatever. And his one was about the kind of characteristics and behaviors of good teachers, whereas mine was more about kind of methodology. And he kind of, slightly with a wink, suggested that I might not be too keen on the results of his particular survey and talk. I am a kind of, if you like, a bit of a methodologist. I've written this book, Teaching Lexically, with my colleague and friend, Hugh Deller. And in a way, what we outlined there are what actually I would call principles for an eclectic methodology. It's under the name of Teaching Lexically because we were very influenced by the lexical approach and Michael Lewis, which Dan mentioned earlier. But the idea was in a way to recognize that people are using different materials. There may be different techniques that we use, but what we want to do is to have some core ideas of method and core principles to which we can make choices about the techniques and language that we choose. So what do I mean by a lexical approach? Well, what I would say is its language consists of words, word combinations, and from that, patterns can be seen, they can be conformed to, and they can be adapted. So what essentially that means is the kind of what Dan described there from Michael Lewis as grammaticalized lexis. The point is the words come first. This is what drives meaning. And we combine words together, and then we can see whole chunks which have grammatical features which we can draw attention to. But the grammar kind of comes second to the words. Within vocabulary and grammar, the core meaning is very simple, but it's fuzzy. And the usage is what complicates things. So when we're combining words and grammar together, and the way a native speaker would use it. And because it's come from our experience of how language is used, the rules are maybe a bit unclear beyond these kind of core simple meaning. And what that means is essentially you can't get accuracy of usage from an explanation or from a rule. The accuracy can really only come, if it comes at all, from our experience and usage of language. And, you know, from our point of view, that means accuracy can't come from the classroom, probably. Basically, language learned to a kind of fluent accuracy, you know, where somebody is nearing a kind of native speaker level. That can only come from lots of exposure outside the classroom. Instead, what I prefer is a concept of kind of easy, successful use rather than accurate use. Again, this is drawing attention to what Dan said earlier. And that only comes about, that ease of use only comes about from repeated encounters and attempted use over time. And that will usually be in the same context. So basically where we're using exactly the same chunk in exactly the same way over and over again, like, how are you? You know, what did you do last night? Those kinds of things. But maybe also understanding how it's varied over time. So, you know, where we might use, how was your dinner? How was your stay? How was your, where we're kind of manipulating that kind of chunk, if you like. The accuracy is basically maybe a byproduct, but the reality is most people won't ever be accurate. Most students will never get to that kind of, the way we describe it in terms of native speakers. Many students will finish at B1, and that's quite a good achievement, and it's fine, but it will be an inaccurate kind of end point for them. From that language, from that perception of language, the best way we consider of organizing this kind of language, organizing this learning, which kind of speaks a little bit to the question that Dan was asked about what we teach in the classroom, is I would say that it's outcomes focused. So we have an idea of what the students want to do with their language, and that's what then leads to us preparing and thinking about the language for the task. So we think about what they might want to do. It could be something like functional in the sense of, I don't know, ordering coffee or whatever, but it could be something a bit more emphatic, social, like asking about what did you do at the weekend. That's the outcome that we're aiming for. And what we do is provide the language for the task, that language being these word combinations, grammaticalized lexis. So a kind of more holistic view of it. Where I think kind of more analysis and thinking about grammar and words on their own comes through the review of language, because basically what we would say is that you can't just doing a task. Yeah, language, we can prepare some language, they can practice some language through that task. Some new language might come out from the students' output. But if we just leave that, we need this kind of repetition over time. And it may be that just doing other tasks won't allow for that repetition. So there's a space here for like reviewing language and exploring how it's used, how it's texted, how it could be used in other outcomes, maybe looking at a grammar, the underlying grammar in those chunks, thinking about questions, stories, dialogues around these words. So that's my point of view. As we'll see, Luke had a somewhat different point of view. And his version is about teacher characteristics and behavior. And to be honest, I kind of agreed with him, as we'll see in a second, that there are certain behaviors which I think probably do need to be fundamental for a good teacher. And otherwise, whatever method you're using will probably fail. But I think principles and methods may be a prerequisite for some of them, and different methods may intrinsically encourage or discourage some of these non-method behaviors. And I'm going to show you how I think teaching lexically combines with these things. So what was Podrumu's list? So if you're not thinking of, method, just think of good teachers you had. What constitutes a good teacher? Think of the ones that you had before. What kind of characteristics or behavior might you expect? Do stick in the chat box. Okay, let me show you some of what Luke came up with and see how many of them coincided with your ideas. These were his list. They weren't quite in this order originally, I've put them in those because I'm going to go through them in this order. So first is the teachers notice the students and their needs. They're good at explaining language issues. They're interactive. They can engage students at a deeper level. They're friendly. They've made classroom a routine skill. They're enthusiastic. And then they have presence, authority, and they question what they do. So how might these kind of link to teaching lexically, particularly, but other methods? The first thing is, I would say, if a teacher isn't friendly, for example, you can see what I mean, that whatever method they're using, there's a good chance the students aren't going to respond to them. And these kind of effective elements, we should never forget, whatever our methodology. And to be honest, I have no disagreement with any of these things in Luke's list. What I would say, though, is how does that, I think, method can contribute. So, for example, if we take this idea of noticing students' needs, noticing students and needs, I'd actually sometimes change it to wants rather than needs. What I would say is what I just described to you in terms of how we plan learning for students is because we are not focused on what students want to do. That is already thinking about their needs and wants. And then within the class, what we want to do is we would recommend focusing on what the students actually say, their outputs, and helping them then to take that further, usually within the task that we set out already, or the outcome that we were aiming for. But I would say also, if the students start talking about other things and they're engaged with that, I would also be encouraging teachers to respond and help them say those things better. Usually focused, as we've mentioned, on word combinations and lexicalized grammar. The second one is that thing about good at explaining things. And I think this is interesting because I think not all methods actually recommend explanation. I mean, if you look at the more extreme ends of task-based learning, for example, they reject explicit teaching. They reject this kind of explicit learning and explanation. I think that's the extreme, but it exists. In other cases, I think when you're looking at those kind of PPP, present, produce, present, practice, and produce kind of models of teaching, again, we're not always focused on how the explanation takes place. Whereas what we looked at in teaching lexically, we have an idea of what meaning is and how we go about getting meaning, if you like, and getting the usage. So as I said, the first point about it is that meanings of words and grammar, whether it's words or grammar, are simple. So, basically I could tell you the present continuous essentially means it's around now and it's unfinished. There really isn't much else to say about it. Students can't kind of be accurate from that explanation or from that meaning, but neither will they become accurate by adding nuance and adding layers of meaning, because grammar is constantly kind of interacting with words in ways which are particular to how English people have used it, or English speakers use that language. And so the accuracy can't come from the detailed explanations. And so if we're looking at helping the students, rather than looking at more detailed explanations, what we want to do is give them a very basic meaning. As Dan suggested, the quickest and easiest is probably translation. And then what we move on to is showing more examples, ideally related to outcomes, but it could be also to the task we're focused on, for example, but it could also be highlighting other ways it might be used in other situations. And then what we'd also recommend is kind of then getting the students to think about how they chunk that word combination, or we ask questions to explore the usage and knowledge of those words. I'll give you some examples. So if you take like teaching lexically and chunking, what I think this also kind of speaks to is this affective focus of the teachers being interactive and engaging students at a deeper level. So if we take at a lower levels, this could be at a beginner level or certainly an elementary student, where we might have a task that we're talking about our friends. We could give them the chunk. We can show them, I've known my friend John for 6 years. We could translate that so they have the meaning. And then what the students are doing is we would ask them to manipulate it and talk about their own friends. So, I mean, you could do it now. You kind of go, I've known my friend for, and then obviously at a lower level, quite often the students will have this other knowledge here. They'll be able to explore how it's used. We could also then push them beyond that. We could imagine the students might even try and say this. We could help them say it. We can either present this kind of phrase before, or we can respond to their efforts when they talk about their friends, where they have a phrase like this. We were in the same class at uni. So the students, again, they can learn that whole phrase. It's something they might be able to use in its entirety, actually, with other students. We could then reduce it. We could chunk it in a way. We were actually really the we were should be in bold as well, I think, here. We were in the same class at, any other suggestions? Not too difficult. School or it's limited, actually, what that would be. What about this one? We lived on the same. Any thoughts what that would be? We could, again, elicit from the students. We can show them this pattern of how the same works. And we could then maybe broaden it still. What other things might students want to say about their friends and where they first knew them? We, the same, what? How could we complete this particular chunk? Any thoughts? We like it the same class. We were in the same. Again, you see the many possibilities. So what we're doing is following this framework. We might give them the meaning. We show them the chunk. We show them how it might be changed, and then we engage in them on a deeper level by asking them their ideas, and we're interacting with them. What you might find is, for example, in this second one, we lived on the same building. here might be an example where you could say, yeah, you could either accept that actually as successful communication, or if you wanted to, we could introduce the idea we lived in the same building, and we can highlight how it's changed there. Similarly, at a higher level, we could go with a chunk like this. Just because I focus on grammar doesn't mean I can't be interactive. I mean, this is obviously true. I'm not suggesting that grammar-focused lessons are never interactive. What I want to suggest is that teaching lexically in particular, or a lexical approach, has the possibilities, has a kind of natural inclination to engage with students. What might be an alternative here? I might give another example, because I focus on grammar doesn't mean just because I'm a man doesn't mean I only talk about sport. Apologies for the incorrect thing. Any other kind of chunks you could go for using this thing? Just because I doesn't mean. Yes, just because I'm yawning doesn't mean I'm bored. Hopefully, yeah. And what you get is, and I noticed this also there with "we dated the same girl," is that what students will do is exactly what you've done, which is you may be thinking, maybe it's a made-up example, maybe it's a joke, maybe it is actually drawing on some experience. And what I might do as a teacher is follow up on that joke. We dated the same girl. Oh, that's difficult. That's awkward. Or, we might kind of then develop that in some ways, or ask them a particular, if it was true or if they've experienced that. Similarly, I mentioned these questions that we might ask. And this is, again, where I would move away from what I certainly learned on my CELTA course around concept checking questions, which are very much focused on grammar. They were designed originally for grammar, although they're often applied to vocabulary. And certainly how I was taught them is that you focus on, you don't include the language you're practicing or asking about. You ask closed questions, yes or no. And the problem with that is it's kind of interactive. We do see whether the students have understood your explanation, which is fine, but it's not engaging students with a very deep level. So, for example, if I asked, do you go on strike? I might tell the student the meaning through a translation. If I then ask them questions like, so am I at work? Am I happy about the situation? Where I'm breaking down the meaning and asking yes or no. I mean, often students are kind of going, well, yeah, you just told me what strike means. I've told you what it is in my language. Where's the engagement here? It's on a kind of rather superficial level. And certainly the students aren't producing other language. So this is why I would prefer what I call kind of divergent checking questions, which are more focused on exploring usage, where they demand retrieval of other language. So we're helping them in that longer term process of using language and remembering it. And it also reveals what the students know and don't know. Again, this refers back to the needs, being responsive to students' needs. And the kinds of questions I'm thinking of are Why might a teacher join a union? Any thoughts? You can, again, just write in your chat box if you like. Better wages, security, working conditions, similar to kind of the thing. Protection from allegations and bullying. Now, what you see is we've got quite a simple, we could say quite a simple vocabulary item. We teach them the idea of union. Again, I would go for a simple translation. But what we would find out is whether the students know the word protection, allegations, bullying. They may express it in different ways. We may accept that. We may accept it as being successful understanding and successful retrieval of what they know. Or we could see that as this is the next area of their learning if they're going to use this language. And often it will be supportive if you then go on to have a task, for example, where you're discussing whether you should join a union or not, whether you should have a union or not in your school. That might be a point of discussion. Okay. Similarly, let's have a look at some other ones. What might you ask or say if someone says, "I'm freezing"? Yeah, let's go inside. Shall I turn up the heat? You should wear a jacket. I mean, there's lots of nice to meet you freezing. There you go. And you make the joke. And again, these are the kinds of things which happen actually in classroom. People do make jokes as we go through. What might be the opposite of we're making progress? Any thoughts on that one? We're regressing. We're lost. We're stuck. We're not getting anywhere. Yeah. We're struggling, maybe. Going backwards. Yeah. So what you see is, again, there's a variety of possibilities, and what it does is it generates, we can share these ideas amongst the group. We can choose what is most appropriate for the next step for the students. We get more information about what they know and what they don't know so that we can manage and deal with their needs. You get the idea. I'm not going to go through all of those. A very common one is to focus on what else, going to focus on aspects of collocation. What else do you lose? What else might you miss? Those kinds of aspects. And those are okay questions. But what really interests me are these particular kind of more divergent ones where we're looking at the surrounding language that typically goes with the words that we're teaching, because that will tend to feed in better to the final outcome that we're after. And it also kind of gives a more varied, interesting, and I think deeper level of understanding for the students. And then the kind of last area on this particular interactive, engaging students at a deeper level is the doing tasks themselves. Because if we're doing tasks, especially at lower levels, a focus on outcomes will tend towards students engaging in somewhat more meaningful interactions rather than low-level syllabuses, which tend to focus on getting the particular grammar structure correct. And I think that is a more engaging way of working. You'll certainly get more recycling of different grammar structures, and you'd get more genuine interaction as a result of it. The next area is friendliness and enthusiasm. I mean, I this may be a little bit of a push, okay, but I feel, and this was somewhat my experience when I started learning. I'm not doing it now, sadly, but a few years ago, I studied Russian, and I was doing it in two different classes. I had a kind of one-to-one situation where I was following more or less the syllabus of outcomes beginner, and I suppose a more teaching lexically approach, which was focused on meaningful interactions. And then in my other, I went to another class in town where it was a more traditional class and very much focused on grammar rules, doing exercises, getting the answers to those exercises. And I mean, obviously, this is a bit prejudiced because I'm a teaching lexically fan, so maybe I was more engaged because of that. But what I noticed was the classroom, there's less space for the kind of laughter, nice kind of laughter, that came out regularly in my one-to-one classroom compared to this grammar-focused one. And what I think it was is that when you focus very much on an exercise, in a way, all you can do is get it right or wrong. And very many low-level communication tasks are essentially doing the same thing. They're really kind of controlled practice. Then they're naming things. They're saying what I have and what you have. There's not very much space for the students to give of themselves and to get from the other people. And if you fail, I mean, it's just failure. There's a kind of, it's slightly dispiriting. What I found actually when I was trying myself to communicate and say things, it was a struggle. It was hard. I would make many mistakes. I would often resort to English. Sometimes I would do mimes. I would be all over the place in terms of my grammar. But those moments where I made the communication, where the teacher understood what I was saying or my colleague understood what I was saying, brought me immense joy. And it's the joy of just communicating something of yourself in a foreign language is something very motivating and important. And I think this is something which certainly, obviously, if you're following a task-based learning, I think you're going to be getting something similar. But I think it is something that can be lost in a very grammar-focused lesson, particularly at lowest levels. What often happens is we kind of make up for that through games and tasks like that, which I don't have, I'm not completely against, but not everybody likes games, particularly if you're an adult. And again, that can be an issue in terms of that friendliness. What I would say is, in terms of mastering classroom practice, clearly, I think this is true. And what I see with CELTA courses, perhaps not Teaching House's CELTA courses, but other less reputable ones, is that sometimes what you get are that principles get hidden. We're not actually getting a full picture of what the method is. And that can, I think, lead to a certain amount of confusion and what I would say cognitive dissonance for some teachers who've experienced something completely different. And that causes resistance between the teacher and the method. Things I'm thinking of are things like pair work equals student-centered, whereas I think we could do lots of whole class teaching where we're engaging with students in genuine conversation and helping them say things better, would be very student-centered. Similarly, reduce, connected with that, is this just reduce TTT, teacher talking time. What kind of teacher talking time? What is the purpose of the teacher talking time? No translation. Why is that? What's the how does that relate to the bigger method, if you like? How does it relate to our principles about language and learning? And so I think what I would say is the kinds of practice that I've just shown you kind of go with the method. And in order to be confident in those methods, we do need to know what the method is, if you like. We do have to have a kind of methodology. And I think this is what leads to these kind of authority and presence aspect. Without clear principles, often what we're left with is doubt and anxiety. Because when we see things go wrong, we're not sure why. Or we're not sure, we don't have a framework to understand how it works. So I think, having a clear method, it really is important in a way for having that authority and presence for a teacher. And when you have those things, the class management and your authority, it kind of leads again space for things which the method may, other aspects of being a teacher. These are from, again, Luke's, an article by Luke, where he talks about kind of outer circle of things which good teachers do. They're recognized as friends, as social workers, counselors. Our ability to notice students and to address their needs are made easier if we are secure in the method that we are using and the class processes that we've mastered through that method. And the last point, I think, is questioning what we do. In the same way, if we don't have clear principles, what is the framework for reflection and addressing? Sorry, missed a bit off there. Addressing those things which we think have gone wrong. I think basically you need a method. You need to have clarity about your principles. I would be recommending teaching lexically, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, if you believe and have principles about a kind of grammar rules plus words approach, for example, then it's being clear about what that approach is and the impacts of it, which helps you then to question when things have gone wrong, how I could improve, what I do next. And within that, I leave you with these kinds of questions, which I ask myself and which I hope reflect the principles that I have with teaching lexically. So my first point is, what did I learn about my students today? And what did they learn about each other? And this speaks to, if they didn't learn anything about each other and I didn't learn anything, this suggests that maybe I'm not addressing the students' needs, their wants. I'm not providing those opportunities for expressing their thoughts and feelings. That I didn't have a clear enough outcome, perhaps. Then I might be asking, what new language did they learn? So this could be something I presented. Did they get the chance to use it? Could they use it outside of class? This speaks to me of presenting word combinations more than grammar rules, because I believe the word combination is driving meaning, driving communication is easier to put to use than the grammar rule. It doesn't mean that we don't have any kind of reference to grammar rules, as we've seen, but that would be where I'm thinking about it. And similarly, if they didn't get a chance to use it, was that because what I chose to teach didn't really match the outcome or the task that I gave them? So, maybe I need to readjust, rethink what I'm presenting there. What questions did I ask about the language? Did they generate other language? Did they support the speaking? So this speaks to this, thinking about the engagement with the students, engaging them on a deeper level, and ensuring a certain kind of interactivity within the classroom as part of the learning process. And those questions can also come from the students. What questions did they ask? And were the answers I gave actually useful? I mean, this is an area which I often find myself changing my mind about, because the temptation is so easy to give more detailed explanations based on an idea of how words are used. And then when you go back and you find examples how the words are used, there's loads of examples of what you thought was completely wrong. I mean, I'll give you a very brief. It was an example where I had was in a class, an advanced class. It came out that we were teaching. Some of the students said something like, "We have a bird box or something like this outside our a bird house." I think they used. Maybe they used bird house. To be honest, I've now forgotten which is the correct one and which is not. But I changed it to bird cage or bird box, I think. And then when I looked it up, did a search on Google, loads of examples of what the student had said. And it's a bad answer. I shouldn't have bothered. I should have maybe focused on something else. What language did I teach? Notice that I haven't before. This speaks to me not getting stuck in what I want to teach and being prepared to follow the student's needs and wants, which often brings up things that I wouldn't have thought teaching before. Again, it's more about the response of how I teach, responding to students in giving input. And again, I may make wrong choices in terms of level. I might think that actually that was too hard for them, particularly at the lower levels. Maybe it was too colloquial. Maybe there was an easier way for them to say it, which featured more frequent words, which was more accessible to them. Maybe had a simplified grammar. Maybe I could have avoided some grammar form, or maybe I just give them a simpler example of that grammar. And then the last thing I'd be thinking about is, how can I revise that language? So I'm thinking about whatever I've taught, whatever's come up, whatever I planned, have I thought about how that's going to be recycled? Could it be useful in another class? Can it come through another task, which will come up later? I think what you'll find at lower levels, if you follow an outcomes focus, then yeah, actually a lot of language will just get naturally much more frequently recycled because it's so common. But at higher levels, as you go up, you'll probably find that you need to start much more from vocabulary, that there are much fewer opportunities to recycle particular words, and that we need to kind of do something actively ourselves or encourage the students to do something actively there. And, we could then think about whether that could turn into an exercise, a task, new lesson. Could I do it in another course? And that's it. Hopefully what you see there is, if we return to our, very quickly, I should have given you the last frame there. If we turn to our list, yes, I think these are effective factors, which are really important. We do need to have them. I do believe that these are really quite essential to being a good teacher. But the method and in particular, I think teaching lexically or a lexical approach can really feed in and support these kind of effective factors. And that's it. Thanks very much.